We are going to talk about sex this afternoon, and I hope you will. Share your questions, your criticism, your comments. So please make good use of that opportunity. I'm looking forward to respond to your thoughts and your questions. Okay, the sexual revolution, how to understand and respond to the revolution of sex. And the first part, I'm going to talk about a more historic perspective of the four basic views on sex. But before I go into that, let me give you some introductory remarks. I'm really glad we can have this conversation about sex, but it is also a great challenge for me as a speaker, because there are so many difficult aspects and so many personal aspects of this subject. And I don't know who you are who are listening, and I don't know your life story, and I don't know what has been placed in your backpack, so to speak. We all have a history, and I don't know your history, your struggles and joys or sorrows, and your scars, and how your life is, and a number of aspects of relating to sexuality. It's much better to be discussed face to face or around a coffee table instead of in this lecture format through the internet. So there's a lot of limitations here, but we need to make the best we can of this situation. And I'm aware of this personal side that I cannot address the way I would like to do if we were sitting in the same room. Many of us have a background in the Christian church and belong to a Christian church. And I think many of us have an experience that issues about sex are difficult to handle, difficult to discuss and process. And too many churches have this kind of attitude. Please, no explanations inside the church. So the churches might be teaching a certain view or certain understanding of sex, but there is maybe not much of an explanation or a motivation for why this perspective, why this teaching, and how does that relate to alternative views. So I hope we will be able to do better and search for explanation and understanding. When I think about the different attitudes I've seen in churches, I think we very often fall into one of two pitfalls. There are two dangers for Christians when we talk about sex. One danger, which I think is a very common danger and a strong temptation today, is that we are very aware of the culture around us, which have moved far away from a Christian understanding of what it is to be a human being and a Christian understanding of sex. And in order to fit into our own culture, there is a tendency to lowering the ethical bar, to adjust ideals in terms of sexuality to our fallen reality. That is the temptation of more liberally orientated churches. So in the end, the church is just a mirror of the surrounding culture. We say the same things, maybe with a little bit more of a pious language. The other danger, which may be more prevalent in conservative or evangelical churches, is that we have a kind of hypocrisy and harshness, where we are not really honest about the struggle and the problems. and we have a certain teaching, and if we are upholding certain ideals, but then we hide the gap between this ideal and the reality, and we pretend that everyone is living according to these ideals. And the big thing is not to be exposed, because if you're exposed, then you're kicked out of the fellowship, then you are condemned. And that is not a beautiful picture either. So I think we need to approach the subject of sex with an attitude from the gospel solution to this dilemma, the dilemma between the ideal and our reality. That solution is God's grace. Through Jesus Christ, there is forgiveness for our history, for our sins, and God's Spirit in sanctifying us and helping us to move in a new direction and coming closer and closer to the ideals of God. So that's the attitude I hope we can have here this afternoon, an attitude marked by the gospel, God's grace and God's Spirit. I recently learned about something from the Japanese culture called kintsugi. Maybe it's pronounced very different, but kintsugi. And it's this. The Japanese have an ancient tradition called kintsugi. Instead of discarding a beautiful ball that has been broken, they use gold to repair it, creating a vessel that is unique and even more valuable than before. Kintsugi illustrates the truth that nothing is ever truly broken beyond repair. Rather than hiding the brokenness, the gold creates something new and cherished. Wow, what a beautiful picture of the gospel. Nothing is ever truly broken beyond repair. That's true of us. We are broken human beings. But the gospel offers us hope. God's grace and God's Spirit can repair us. And it can be something really beautiful in the end. So it's with that hopeful attitude that we can approach this subject. A number or quite a lot of non-Christians, when they hear that we are going to talk about sex, they often, I think, want to silence the Christians. At least that's the situation here in Sweden. So they say, relax, why are you so obsessed with sex? It's a very strange accusation, because it is the contemporary culture that is really obsessed with sex. Culture around me talks about sex much, 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 much more than the churches do. So I don't think we are obsessed with sex, not at all. Actually, I think we talk too little as Christians about this dimension of life, because it's an important dimension of life. We should have a broad perspective dealing with all aspects of human life, and sex is one important aspect. So it's natural, of course, that we want to talk and think about sex. Other wants to silence us by accusing us of hypocrisy. You are such hypocrites, they say to us. And there is some truth to that accusation. But let us do some thinking here. A hypocrite, what is that? A hypocrite is someone who accuses people of wrongdoing and at the same time pretend of being above such wrongdoing oneself, even though in reality you don't pass the test. Now that is hypocrisy. But the problem is not to talk about a certain moral principle, even if you yourself have failed that principle. That's not hypocrisy. That makes you a sinner, absolutely, but not necessarily a hypocrite. Think about the principle, you should not lie. I think nearly all of us would agree on that principle, and yet we have all lied. Does that make us hypocrites? No, not as long as we are honest about who we are. So we can still discuss moral principles, even if we have failed ourselves, as long as we do not pretend to be anything than we actually are. So that is the kind of attitude I hope we will bring with us to this afternoon. And personally, this is an area where I've had my share of struggle. And this is an area where I hope to be formed by the attitude of the gospel. I like this quote of Mark Twain. We're all like the moon. We each have a dark side. And that is part of the Christian view of man, of Christian view of human beings, that we are created wonderfully by God, but we are also broken and we have a dark side, and that is also related to sexuality. So let's play with open cards here. I recently read a text, it's from a book, Society and Sanity, and it says this: the typical modern man practically never thinks about sex. What? Well, hang on. He dreams of it, of course, by day and by night. He craves for it, he pictures it, is stimulated or depressed by it, drools over it. But this frothing, steaming activity is not thinking. Drooling is not thinking. Picturing is not thinking. Craving is not thinking. Dreaming is not thinking. Thinking means bringing the power of the mind to bear. Thinking about sex means striving to see sex in its innermost reality and in the function it is meant to serve. Wow. There's some wisdom in that. I hope we can do some thinking about sex this afternoon. And let's start to think about what's the basic alternatives in terms of sex. If you study human history and human cultures, of course, there's many different ways to think about sex. But if we generalize, I think we can say that human cultures have chosen one of 4 general ways of thinking about sex, 4 different views of sex, and that can help us to start to think about this subject. The first way is what I call the boundless way, where you say sex is good, sex is natural, it's just a given part of human nature, and you should explore it and express it as much as you can. There are no boundaries, or if there are some boundaries, it's very few. You try to press out the boundaries as far as you can. Many cultures have gone this way, looking at sex as we look at food or drink. Enjoy it as much as you can, as long as it's not become self-destructive for you. We can see in ancient Greece, here is Demosthenes, a Greek statesman, 300 BC, talking about mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of the body, but wives to bear as legitimate children. And we could, of course, add that in ancient Greece, men also added sex with boys and young men, and so on. And we have it, of course, in Western culture. We can think of the Playboy philosophy, Hugh Hefner, saying sex is the driving force on the planet. We should embrace it, not see it as the enemy. So embrace it as far as you can. Press the borders as far as you can. Okay, that's one view. The other view is the opposite. Then you see the ugliness of the boundless view, because there will be so much selfishness, so much emptiness, so much ugliness, and so many human victims if you go down that route. We can see that in antiquity, we can see that in the Western world. The boundless view of sexuality is not a beautiful view that dignifies men and women. So then you have a strong reaction to say, wow, look at what's happening when you affirm sexuality. Let's suppress this. This is a dangerous, ugly, unclean part of who we are. It's basically a problem that we are bodily and sexual beings. Unfortunately, you can find quite a number of voices within the Christian church having this perspective. A number of the church fathers being inspired not by the Bible, but by some Greek philosophy, the Neoplatonic philosophy. So Clement of Alexandria, he says, sex is only for procreation. Even within marriage, you should not have sex unless it is for procreation. And the view here is that God has created humankind, but sexual desire and sexual passion was not original. It came with a fall. It's part of the sinful nature of man. So you shouldn't have sex except for procreation. And when you have sex for procreation, you should, if possible, I don't know how they did it, but you should have it without passion or desire or lust. You should be as detached as you can from your spouse's body. So this is of course an extreme view, and there are different versions of it, but basically it is a view where you are afraid of sexuality, or you view it as something unclean, something that is better to abstain from. The third view says, no, it's not unclean. It's actually a way to God. So that's a view that combines sexuality with religion and say sexuality is one road to God. Religious ecstasy, mystical ecstasy, and sexual ecstasy can merge together and connect you with the divine. We can see that in the Old Testament, where the cultures around Israel, they had a lot of female and male temple prostitutes, where religious worship acts and sexual acts were joined together. And of course, we have it very strongly and very visible in some Indian traditions, in the tantric temples, where they combine spirituality and sexuality into a very powerful mix, and very dangerous mix if you see what's happening in different sects and cults. It's a very dangerous road to go. And finally, you have what one can say a balanced view, where you're not connected sex as a way to reach God, but as a true way to connect uniquely with one human being, where you say sex is good in its right place, with its right person. And you try to paint a certain area saying, within these boundaries, here you can explore and express and enjoy sexuality because it's a great gift from God. But outside those boundaries, it takes on another dimension and becomes something else, which is destructive. So it's a view where you try to connect sexuality to a more holistic view of life and put sex into its right place, and try to define an area within where you can express sexuality in a good and healthy way. And it is that area we are now going to try to define and look at.
Thank you. Our next question says 1 Corinthians 6:18 speaks about the one who commits fornication as one who sinneth against his own body. Could you please explain this theology?
Yes, thank you. First Corinthians is a very important letter in terms of a Christian understanding of sexuality, and there is actually 2 full chapters where Paul is dealing with different aspects of sexuality, both chapter 6, which you were referring to in the question, and chapter 7. And we are in my last talk, I will come back and make some comments on those 2 chapters. In terms of sinning against your own body, Paul is not saying that by fornication you're sinning only against your own body. You are, of course, also sinning against another person's body. And the whole idea here is that there is a design, a meaning to our body and to our sexuality. And when we go against that design and that meaning, we are not breaking an arbitrary rule, some written law. We are breaking something more fundamental. We are breaking the design of reality, of who we are meant to be, of who God created us to be. And so therefore we are sinning not only against the moral law, not only, which is of course the main thing, not only against our Creator who has given us life, but we are also sinning towards ourselves, because we are not living in accordance with who we are as created in God's image. So if you think of Genesis 1, one of the main things there is that God created this world by his word. 10 times the text says, and God said. And then it came into being, God said. What is the meaning by that? What is the message? Well, if you think about yourself walking in the forest, you can hear the wind in the trees. There's no message. There's no meaning in that sound. You can maybe hear a tree falling, a very loud sound, but there is no meaning in that sound. But if suddenly you hear a voice, someone says, hello, or come, or stop, it's sound waves, but there is meaning, there is intention. And this is one of the main points in Genesis 1, that God has created us through his word, which means there is meaning in this creation. And therefore there is meaning with my existence. And that includes, there is a meaning for me sexually. And when I go outside that meaning, I sin against God and the moral law and another person's body and my own body.
Okay, we have a clarifying question. Does the balanced view on sex still see sex and sexuality as a normal part of being?
Yes, sexuality is absolutely, completely a normal part of human existence. And we will soon move into that, try to understand the Christian view. But it's one of the basic aspects of our identity as human beings, as males and females, that we are bodily, we are physical, and we are sexual beings. And that is a good thing, it's a natural thing, and it's with us. It's with us in our existence most of our lives. So it's a natural thing that is to be affirmed that we are sexual.
Okay, we might have time for one or two more questions. So our next question is, how does God fit into the balanced approach? Does Ephesians not teach that marriage teaches of the relationship between God and the church?
So I will soon say more about how God fits into the picture. Ephesians 5 takes a marriage as a picture, as a symbol of Christ's love for the church. So the man and the wife is called to, in marriage, express the same kind of sacrificial love towards each other as Christ has shown for us, his church, his bride. So marriage has that dimension of illustrating the gospel in that sense. But there are more dimensions to the marriage. So marriage is there from the beginning in creation as a natural part of what God has intended for human beings.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This says, what is it in the Western culture that has drawn us to this place where boundless sex has become such a predominant force that it seems to be upending even objective science?
Yeah, that's a good question. We will move into that question. One aspect of it is not related to us being the Western world, but is related to us being sinners and in rebellion against God, and listening more to our fallen nature than listening to our conscience, or even more listening to God's revelation, to God's word. And we then, in the area of sex, as in so many other areas, chooses to walk our own way. And that is what the Western culture has been doing now very consciously for the last 200 years, trying to distance ourselves from God and from God's revelation. So it's an expression of the sinful nature of us as human beings, and we are not the only culture. Many cultures have chosen to go in that direction. The surprising thing is that historically, for 2,000 years, or some parts for 1,000 years, we have been a Christian culture. Of course, a culture cannot be Christian in a biblical sense. A Christian is someone who is personally forgiven by Christ and related and are now in communion with Christ, and a culture cannot be that. But we have been a culture inspired by and marked by Christian values, and yet we have now moved away from that. But that is actually the next part of the presentation here. So let's move into our next talk. Thank you for good questions. I hope you continue to ask questions, and I'm happy to respond to as many questions as possible.